I want us to be on schedule, so I'll be really quick and just introduce my dear friend who's going to kick off this panel. Yes, the most original voices in my life as a poet, as a spoken word artist. He's actually manages the art program at Define American. We met 5 years ago, and it was like watching someone. he was doing a poem at this event at Sundance, and it was like watching somebody being lit on fire. And I was like, who is this man? And how do I get in touch with him? So our relationship was born, and I'm very proud to be his colleague, and more than that, very proud to be his brother from another mother. So here's Yosimar Reyes.
Buenas tardes, y'all look so cute. So my name is Yosimar Reyes. I'm a poet, a writer. I write a lot of short stories. I don't know if you could tell, but I'm undocumented and stuff, so it's really cute these days. So I do a lot of work about telling narratives of undocumented people. And this short story that I'm gonna read, I graduated from San Francisco State with a BA in creative writing. And one of my first assignments to write was to write up, I had one of these professors that's really like, poetry and very like dangerous minds, write about it. And so they told me to write about summer. And I was like, what about summer? We never had summer. I'm a bitter immigrant. So like, I'm gonna write about summer. So this is what I wrote. Summer. Abuela wakes me up at 8. It is Saturday morning, and though most kids are up at this hour watching cartoons, Abuela already has breakfast served for me. The sun is already blazing and slowly taking over the streets of Eastside San Jose. After we are done drinking our café con bolillo, we head out the door, and I follow Abuela as she picks a shopping cart that will be a helper for the day. We begin walking down the street. She pulls the shopping cart from the front as I lean my arms, pushing through the back. The wind blows her long white hair, and imagine she's a river, a powerful body of water that carried me here. She looks back at me, and in her face there's a sweet smile. I smile back, and though I begin to get frustrated that the sun is beating against my skin, I say nothing because she has always told me to be grateful for the light of day. We stop at a big green house. The grass is neatly trimmed and the windows are crystal clear. Abuela makes her way to the back of the house, and I take a break and sit under a bush for shade. She comes back carrying a trash can filled with bottles, her small body bending as she struggles to pour them into our cart. I run to help her, but she tells me to stay put, that I'm too small and might get hurt. I watch her as we go from house to house, repeating this routine, the sun increasing in its intensity. The houses on this block are beautifully painted, surrounded by rose bushes and a silence that takes over the street. I imagine what it must be like to live in a place where there is no noise, where everything rests in its proper place. I begin to dream of a day in which I will be old enough to buy a house. I want a big room for my abuelitos, a room for my brother, and one for me. As we continue walking, I see kids playing in their front yards. They pass a ball around, and as soon as they take a look at me, they stop and stare. Their eyes look at me like I'm something strange. By this point, our cart is filled with so many bottles that the rattling is taking over the street. Abuela pulls the cart with force, and for some reason, I freeze. A slow fire begins to burn in the pit of my belly, and the blazing sun helps it turn into rage. Out of nowhere, I get mad. I want to stop pushing this stupid cart and run home. My mind begins to fill up with all these questions I know are impolite to ask. Abuela turns back and sees me standing there. She shouts, "Gordo, apúrate." I look at her, and she can see the anger in my eyes. She knows this rage. She knows this fire. She stops pushing the shopping cart and walks towards me. ¿Qué tienes, mijo? I ask her. Why don't you have a real job? Why do we always have to come and look at people's trash cans? Why can't we have a house? She wipes the sweat from her brow, rests her hand on her waist, and looks down at me. Pues mira, mijo, we're not in Mexico anymore. Las cosas son diferentes aquí. I'm too old to understand a lot of things, but I know that it's not always going to be like this. I look back at her dark skin shining against the sun. I want to be a big tree and have my shadow protect her from these feelings of shame. Tears begin to well up in my eyes, and I become mad at myself for being mad at her. She grasps my hand. Ándale, ya vámonos. Cuando vendamos estas botellas, te voy a comprar algo. We walk back toward the cart and begin to push again. Our rattling presence echoes through the silent neighborhood. Muchas gracias.
What an amazing way to start. Thank you. So my name is Elizabeth Hutchinson. I am a professor of North American art history, a specialist in Native American art from Barnard College and Columbia University, and I'm so grateful to be the moderator of this panel of amazing storytellers. We don't have a huge amount of time. I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly and then ask them to introduce themselves a little bit more extensively. You have a wonderful biography for each one in your program. So what I've asked them to do is just share with you today what story they want to tell that sets the table for today's conversation. Conversation about the power of storytelling and the necessity of storytelling in America right now. So just to my right is Cristela Alonzo, a stand-up comedian, actress, writer, and producer, and star of Lower Classy, currently on Netflix. Next to her is Erika Wurth, who is a poet, fiction and nonfiction writer and professor of creative writing at Western Illinois University. And next to Erika is Christopher Myers, an award-winning author and illustrator and in charge of an imprint of books that he might tell us about a little bit later. And then, of course, Yossi. So I'm going to pass the mic down and you guys share a little bit more.
My name's Cristela Alonzo. I'm a first-generation American. I was raised in South Texas, and I actually use stand-up to educate people about life as a Mexican immigrant, because I love politics, but I feel like we only hear one side, and we rarely humanize the people that we love to vilify. And I think in order to educate, the best way to do that is through humor. So I use stand-up comedy to bring the story of my family and share with people my history so that people know that it actually goes against most of the generalizations that people have about actually minorities in general. For me, I think that a lot of our problems stem from economic class more than racial. And I think that a lot of us have so many things in common when we talk about what caste system we actually have that we never talk about in this country. That's kind of the narrative that I like to focus on and make funny.
Hi, my name is Erika, and as was mentioned, I'm a professor of fiction mainly at Western Illinois University, and I'm pretty sure the poet I was saying earlier is dead, and me, it died, and it's okay though. I just still like poetry. But I am Native American. I was raised in Denver, Colorado, and that's like a lot of Native people. There are a lot of Native people in Minneapolis, Denver, Albuquerque, and I think that of course, people from reservations, it's important that we pay attention to their stories, and they are isolated, and I don't mean to make any arbitrary divisions, but I also feel like, why are non-natives so in love with the magical word of reservation? Because over 60% of us live off the reservation. And in my first novel, for example, so many of the reviews, when they didn't point out how vulgar they thought it was, thank you, Publishers Weekly, they were kind of convinced that because, they either A, thought my character was from a reservation because she was Native American, including my publicist, and or B, when they kind of were like, oh, Idaho Springs, Colorado, not a reservation. They would go on and on about how assimilated and distant from her culture was, even though in that book there are 4 languages spoken: English, Spanish, Lakota, and Navajo, and the characters practice Native American church, and the characters speak a lot of these languages interchangeably, and the characters do powwow and all these kinds of things. So I guess that's part of my bag, if you will, is being like, please understand that we are in New York and we are here, and we're not, we're also part of your culture and of our own. So.
We're supposed to tell stories. Okay, so last summer, I'm trying to give you just a little perspective on where I come from on some of this stuff. I'm a writer and an artist, and I make books, and I publish books under an imprint with Random House called Make Me a World Books. Last summer, I was in Munich for a month working with recent refugees from Syria, Mali, Somalia, Nigeria, about 50 kids, most of whom had come alone. And leaving these kids, although we're constantly on WhatsApp, as most young refugee kids are, I was struck by my own sense of responsibility. Here you have a 12-year-old girl who walked and took a small boat from Iraq and got to Munich. That is a heroic story. That is an intrepid adventurer of a child who has seen more in her few years than I probably ever will. I am a storyteller. What is my responsibility to that story? What is my responsibility to that story in the world? Is it, I think that one of the problems that I've been having over the past number of years speaking about diversity in children's literature and how do we tell stories is you get into a room and everybody agrees with you. And clearly somebody doesn't agree because the publishing industry looks the same, the television industry looks the same, so our politics look even worse. So what then, where is the disagreement? I think that we need to get at that disagreement. We need to actually have these conversations in a more interesting way than our good intentions. And I also believe that there are these other questions that are constantly dogging us, questions of authenticity, which I think is a vile question that is really about patriarchy and white supremacy, all that kind of stuff. All these questions of, do you have the right to tell this story or that story? It's really about, do we have responsibilities to our society to talk about the things that we're all talking about in subtle and nuanced and artistic ways? So I hope that we can get at some of that.
Hi, so like Jose mentioned, I'm the arts fellow at Define American, and basically what we're trying to do with the arts program, is promote as many undocumented artists out there as possible. I think one of the things that happens a lot of times, specifically when we come to a lot of events that have a component of migration, and migration is such a theme that that everybody can relate to. But oftentimes, I think right now, currently, as we're speaking this week, undocumented people are being attacked and being deported, and there's some really scary news of what's happening, and a lot of people don't really comprehend what it is. So for us, it's really debunking that. Right now at Define American, we have one of the largest story platforms of people coming out as undocumented in public. We're also working with entertainment, consulting with them, like how are they representing undocumented people in the media? How can we get more visibility of undocumented people? And how do we move beyond the undocumented narrative of undocumented people being these tragic, sad stories of migration, and we start really showcasing undocumented people as joyful people with dignity, people that besides all adversities are still thriving in this country. And I think that's one of the biggest goals that we're doing right now, that undocumented people, it's really tough right now, but we really want to capture how waking up to a country that daily tells you that they hate you and they don't want you here, and to wake up and to choose to go to work and to participate, that's an act of resilience and an act of defiance, and I think we need more of that, and that's what we're striving towards.
Put the second one into play. I think a lot of really interesting things have been put out on the table here. And the next question that I had for you was thinking about how stories get told, the mediums through which our stories, because I think you've all pointed to the fact that people telling their own stories can really change minds and can really help educate beyond stereotypes, notions of authentic representationality, and yet there is, in our world, publishing houses and TV production firms and funding agencies, all of which are essential to the production of stories, but also can reiterate, can reproduce, recapitulate some of these problems as well. I was interested in hearing from you some of your experiences in thinking about different mediums, different platforms, maybe thinking about the compromises or benefits of working through different ways of getting your stories out, both in terms of what you might have to compromise in what you tell, or what you get to tell, or how you shape what you tell in terms of getting your story out there, but also maybe in terms of who your story reaches. Thinking about balancing, because a story really isn't a story without an audience. I think my definition of storytelling involves not just self-expression, but an understanding of that reciprocity that one has with the people receiving that story as a gift, and really committing to taking in what that story has to offer. So maybe we should start at the other end, and we'll just sort of start in different places to get everybody on.
I think for us, one of the things specifically with undocumented narratives is that we've noticed that a lot of, undocumented, being undocumented, or that hit like the national conversation in 2006 with the May 1st boycotts. That's when people are like, oh my God, undocumented people are here. But one of the things that we've noticed with the 10 years that the work that's been doing with undocumented narratives is that we were asking undocumented people to, in essence, relive their trauma. And we asked them to do on camera. You saw all these videos of people crying on camera of like, oh my God, it's so hard. But I started noticing the way that those people, I grew up in an undocumented community, and like it's tough, but I'm like, no, like it's not being portrayed right. It was being cut and edited, but the messaging, the audience was not necessarily undocumented people, it was citizens. So we used these like kind of sob stories to appeal to the consciousness of citizens. And now that since Trump won, we realized, well, that didn't work. So now that we're reevaluating that and we're doing this, like how us as Define American, as a production company, are we gonna show the stories of undocumented people that are thriving besides having documents, and how do we tell these stories, not undocumented stories for undocumented people, so we can empower undocumented people to not be scared and really stand up to the fact that we're connected to a global issue. It's not necessarily within the states. We're connected to a global epidemic. People are migrating because of countries that are, exploiting where we're from. So for us, it's like, how do we empower those people to not be scared and to really fight for being here? Because even though we don't have documents, there's a right that we do have from being here. So yeah, now we're shifting that. I think that's the compromise that we're making, like our audience. And for me as an artist, I really, like the people that don't like me are not gonna like me, and I don't need to cry for them to like me. So I'm just gonna continue creating work that's defiant and unapologetic, and that's what we want. That's what we're striving to, making our audience, empowering more undocumented people to tell their stories from that perspective.
You bring up something that I years ago, a friend of mine, Ariane Campo Flores, who was the Latin American bureau chief for Newsweek, told me this story. He said, whenever he talked about migration with people who had migrated, the stories told over dinner tables and in kitchens were always full of laughter. There's always a question of like, man, did you know he stayed in the trunk for 3 days? 3 days? What? And then, but yeah, he doesn't like to move anyway, that kind of thing. And so there's always this kind of, and then when he translated those stories as a journalist, he had to retell those stories as sad stories, as tragedies. And he felt that he was missing something. When, as a journalist, he felt that his craft did not allow for that space to kind of communicate both the humanity and laughter that is told in dire situations. And I think that brings up a whole host of issues, including, you've said several times that there's power in telling one's own stories. I don't necessarily believe that anymore. I think that the idea of ownership of stories is really hard. It's really hard on a lot of us, I think, who are artists, because I don't want to say that, I don't want anyone to tell me what I can write and can't write. I think that when you have reviews of Erika's work that are saying, well, where's the reservation in this book? There's an authenticity issue that's being put about whether or not it's her right to tell this story or that story. Good art, like I don't want to limit what Josimar has to write, ever. Good art, we need to kind of rethink some of our standards on good art and good narratives and say to ourselves, okay, the reason why this doesn't work is not because it's inauthentic, but because it's badly told. It's that there's a good writer will bring the detail, the research, the care to the work. I mean, when even in the short piece that you read, there's an amount of detail, there's an amount of research, there's an amount of care that lives in that writing that is about your talent as a writer. And it's not, and I know that there are people who've been through, you may have a sister or a cousin or a brother, been through the same experience, can't tell that story for any, I have an aunt who doesn't have the storytelling gene. She's like, just cannot tell a story, no matter how beautiful the story is. I remember one time she said to me, what you call it? You had a great uncle Clovis. He had unusual strength. And I said, well, what, did he do anything with that strength? No, I don't rightly remember. He just had unusual strength. I said, did he do? So the idea is that we have to rely on our skills as artists to be able to tell these stories with the nuance, with the subtlety, with the humor that can communicate all of these things that we're talking about, of humanity and the realness comes in our skills as artists, and I think that we need to be very careful about devaluing our skills as artists in these instances, and say that we are just the sum total of our experiences. I'm the sum total of my experiences and also everything I've read and all the care I've put into my hands and my writing and all these things, and I think that that goes for all of us. And I think that that is also the core of why so many initiatives about selling diverse voices to the world fail, is because they're more interested in saying, well, this is the real truth, told from the real truth of the real people. And like the real truth of the real people is 100 different things. And unless we have good storytellers telling these stories, we're going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy of like commercial and artistic failure, which is really not cool. So.
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple things that will seem unrelated but will come together eventually, which even though my boyfriend is also Native, I call it the Indian monologue, and he's like, I don't like it, you know. Anyway, so in our communities, we call that poverty porn, and I'm sure like people, when they think about Native Americans, if they're not like putting us 500 years ago in buckskin, which is weird, because if you had all these Europeans like in what they wore 500 years ago, do you want to wear that? I don't think you want to do that, although sometimes maybe. Anyway, moving on. So, you know, it's poverty porn, and they'll go to different reservations and they will show like how destitute they are. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to say that doesn't exist. I mean, our infant mortality rate is through the roof. Our poverty is through the roof. There was one reserve in Canada where there were 140 suicide attempts in 2 weeks. So I think sometimes natives go a little too far in being like, really, it's not, and it's like, it is. But I think to represent people, as without joy and without positivity, just reinforces the notion of, yeah, that's right, let's close these reservations down. And that's dangerous, and that is exactly what we're facing right now as, Trump comes in and that administration comes in, and there have been 2 Republican lawmakers who are initiating a bill in South Dakota or North Dakota to terminate the reservations up there right now. That's happening, and that hasn't happened for a long time. So again, that's serious business. But to represent people one-dimensionally, or to imagine there's one authentic story, is fetishizing. It's almost like I went to this totally authentic Chinese restaurant, and it's so creepy, like to imagine that there's one story. It also damages, I think, people of color when they become artists, because I kind of mulled this over a lot during my PhD, which does allow you a lot of independent time to become in debt. And, and I thought, well, who is my audience and who am I as an artist? And I was like, I don't think my job is all that different from Salinger's or Carver's. They're talking about their tribe imaginatively. They are poetically and imaginatively rendering their world, and I'm doing the same thing. But as I became a published person, I realized that it was an ocean, and I would be swimming through the tide of authentic Indian the rest of my life, and I better decide who I was concretely and what that meant for me. And what it's meant for me really is a constant defense of like my work. But I see people like Sharman Alexie, who's great, He was like this writer that when I was young, I was like, oh my God, you know, he's so wonderful. But like you notice so much of his work has, and Indians do this, and Indians do that. And it's just like this little guidebook. And it creeps me out because I feel like I'm not included, even though I recognize the concrete details in that work. So I really became a person who, like Chris was talking about actually earlier, was like, you know, I think a magical thing happens when you write for your own audience. And Kurt Vonnegut said, you only have to write for one person. And for him, that was his sister. And I think you're not going to produce good art, no matter where you're coming from, if you're imagining this audience that is utterly disconnected from who you and your community are. And so there's no way to leap forward imaginatively if you can't, if you're like, you know, if you can imagine a world where people are purple, you can't imagine a world where your mother, like the mother character, has the same skin color as your own mother. So, anyway. Oh, that's right.
I was actually saying this before we got here. My sitcom was on ABC, and I was the first Latina, the first Mexican to actually produce and create the show to put it on air. Like, it had never been done before. I was in the writer's room, and it was so hard to tell my story and have people believe that my story was my story because there were no Latinos on the executive side. So I was basically defending my life to people that weren't familiar with it. Now, what people didn't understand is that in the pilot episode, I was trying to tell a story about my niece and how she wanted to play soccer, but my sister didn't want her to let her play soccer because it wasn't feminine. And the network executive said, oh, that's unbelievable, girls play soccer. Why? I know theoretically they do, but not in my family. You see, like in my family, it's actually very old world culture, and that's actually the problem, is that I'm trying to push them into this new world, and they're like, no, it doesn't happen. Girls play soccer. Like, give me another story. It's like, well, here's the story. Women got the right to vote in the United States in 1920. In Mexico, it wasn't until 1953. So there's like a 33-year difference. And even then, women had to ask their husbands for permission to go vote. So there's a 30-year gap between the evolution of the United States and the women, and in Mexico, the women, and they couldn't understand that. Now, I never Googled any reviews. I don't like reading reviews. I can't stand them. It's just people's opinions. Like, who cares? Like, you know, except for maybe Yelp. But you know, it's like, but it's that thing where like so many people would tell me that they read a review and they called my show stereotypical, which was never. I couldn't understand that because the show was based on my life. So basically, you're saying that my life is a stereotype. Now, in the show, I had the woman that played my mother, who was very old world and just, you know, didn't understand what I was trying to do. Like in real life, when I told my mom that I wanted to do theater and, you know, just perform, my mom's like, "Pero why do you want to be a clown?" Like, she couldn't understand it, right? And like, so we have that thinking. And then in the show, I had my sister, who's the mother of, you know, who's more modern and everything. And people would always say, well, why is the mom in the show such a stereotype? And I'd always say, which one? My mother or my sister? Because there's two. Like, I understand what you mean, but you're looking at it in the wrong lens. You're not seeing that what I'm trying to do is show the evolution between every generation. You know, and the studio and the network would say, people love aspirational stories. You should make them rich. I'm like, it's my life story and I was poor, you know? And actually, when I think of aspirational, I think of seeing the rise of the family that starts from poverty and ends up in a better situation. That, to me, is aspirational. When you can actually see that it seems like a possibility. You know, it seems possible. I grew up not having any representation on TV. I became completely in love with the Black culture, because that to me was the closest thing I could understand and relate to. You know, it was that thing where, like, in my neighborhood, even like with music, rap, so much of rap spoke to my neighborhood. Nobody was doing that kind of story. Nobody was telling that. I had to find the narrative wherever I could. Now, what I find difficult is that as a Latina, that year we had Jane the Virgin and my show. Those were the two Latino shows that came out. Now, when the network discovered that I spoke Spanish, I had to do all my publicity in Spanish. I had to do all of these interviews in Spanish. I had to do everything in Spanish. And I would always say, like, well, but Jane the Virgin doesn't have to do that. And they're like, oh, well, she can't speak Spanish. And I'm like, okay, then why do I have, I'm not showing the show in Mexico. Like, it's an American show. I speak English. Why do I have to do it in Spanish? They're like, because you're trying to get Latinos. I'm like, yeah, my Latinos, like the English-speaking Latinos. So I had to do all of this press, and it was insane because people would say, oh, that show is such a stereotype. I'm like, the name of the show is Cristela. It's not called Every Latino in the World. You know, like, we don't see Roseanne and think that every white mom is like Roseanne. So why do other shows get the luxury of having different stories, and why do I have to represent everybody? Because think about it, even yesterday I had a tweet where somebody was tweeting at me, and they listed all of these like Latina actresses that they admired, and I was in it. And I was the only Mexican in that list. Everybody else was Puerto Rican. And see, people don't understand that even within the Latino community, Mexicans don't get to be represented as well as Puerto Rican or Cuban, you know? And it's always that thing, because I personally feel in the past couple of years, well, by past couple of years, I mean my entire lifetime, Mexicans have been we've always won the branding of so many problems. We're the problem to immigration. We're the problem, like, it's always us, even though we're right next door, we're neighbors, you know? So it's really hard because the stories end up being like, well, I remember in the show, they're like, why doesn't she date? Why don't you date in the show? Like, why don't you date? And I'm like, because I didn't date. Like, the story was based on a real time in my family where I was forced to drop out of college to take care of my sister's kids because she couldn't afford a nanny, and that was my duty as a Mexican woman in this family. I dropped out of college, never went back, couldn't go back. Didn't have the luxury to date, I was their second mom. I had to work, I had to support. It was just this modern day family that lived under one roof. It was not the nuclear family. It was aunt, mom, everything. We all tried to get by, right? And everybody said, you know what you should do? You should do a Latina Mindy Kaling show. You should do a Latina Mindy project. I'm like, well, you already got it. It's called the Mindy Project. Like, you already got it. Like, I don't want to look for Mr. Right. I want to show the story of someone who's not allowed to find Mr. Right. Because there's a lot of us out there, especially, like, there's a lot of people that sacrifice their lives so that their family could have a better shot. And that's not just a Latino thing. I want to show that my family did it, a Mexican family, but that's something that everybody can relate to. Past Latino, past any ethnicity that you are, it's always about sacrifice. I wanted to show that story because the sacrifice, once you show that, then you see the actual heart of people. And that's when you can that's when you invest, and that's when you suspend disbelief, and you're like, you know what? I don't think I really know what Mexicans are like. I think I just kind of generalized everybody. I want to see that heart. And it's been hard. It's been so hard because I realized that in order to tell my story, I need help on the other side. I need help on the executive side. I can't do it by myself. And trust me, it is an uphill battle, and it is exhausting. It is so exhausting.
I'd like to speak to that a little bit because so for about 20 years, I've made books for children. I started in 1995, was my first book. And this last year was the year that I was like, okay, I need to be doing something on the other side. So Random House had approached me, and I said, okay, look, they asked me, you know, I'd done some op-eds, an op-ed for the Times about diversity in children's literature. And, you know, Random House approached me, and they said, well, what should we do about it? And I said, well, I have some suggestions, but really give me the reins for a little part of the fiefdom. And so there's this thing about you have to be on the other side, because there are things, even what you're talking about, that I so relate to in the publishing world, things like how do we publicize our products, right? So you have a show, and they're like, we're going to have you do all of the press in Spanish. And you're like, number one, you're not getting to the communities that we want to deal with. You're not getting to them effectively. I mean, and we have this in all sorts of ways. We have this from in the theater world to, you know, to the art world. When when you do a big show, how do we get folks from the projects in New York City to come to an art show that's down the block from them, you know? And this is like a very consistent. So we do need support on both sides. It's not simply about us as artists putting out product. It's also about how then do we get that product into the hands of viewers? How do we get that product into the hands of readers? How do we make it clear that, you know, this book is very specific, because specificity is how we get to the universal. We get to the universal by being very, very clear and specific. And that specificity is what should sell it to everyone from, you know, the marketers always have these categories, these demographics in their heads. You know, we need to sell this to housewives in Wyoming or wherever. You know, so that specificity is going to be what gets it to housewives in Wyoming and kids in the projects in New York and kids who live in LA, Colorado, wherever. That we need to revamp our thinking about how we do stuff on the executive side. And I think that's very much what I've been trying to do, but it's clear that that's going to be an uphill battle all across the way.
Really quick, by the way, I think the way to do it is to be honest and tell your true story. Fun fact, the musical that most Latinos have gone to see in the history of Broadway is Fiddler on the Roof. And it's because of tradition and it's because of family. More Latinos have seen Fiddler on the Roof than any other musical. It's not a show written for Latinos. Yet Latinos have gone more than any other show because of the family aspect, because of the culture. They connect to it.
You're making me think of a queer Jewish friend whose parents really supported gay marriage because they believed in marriage, right? So that was like the moment that he became accepted as gay. They always wanted to have a wedding. So this is, I'm hearing a couple of really important threads, I think, in this last round. One of them is that there's still many uphill battles to be fought, even though diversity is now obligatorily part of every conversation. And I think it's partially because diversity seems to still being framed as one representation of each identity, and that identity will be monolithic and represent not only something that's perhaps stereotypical, but also if you're an Indian, you can't also be queer. Or if you're a woman, you can't also be undocumented, right? That we need to see people through one lens, that the story that they're telling represents one lens, and yet intersectionality is such a vital piece of understanding where everybody's coming from and also making these connections, right? That are going to be so essential to broadening these audiences. And that's going to lead me, we don't have a load of time left, but in fact, we don't have any time left. I'm getting the wrap sign. It seems to me that story seems particularly urgent right now, right? I do think that we're working in a moment when division and separation between people is very much the sort of cultural conversation. And so the ability to see the complexities that you guys have been raising is going to be really essential to keep the stories getting out there and helping us all hear. Because as I said, I think listening is, a story's not complete unless there's somebody listening to it. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful panel.